When reclusive millionaire Jonathan Hayes rescues a stranded woman, Emma Carter, during a brutal storm, he expects nothing more than a thank you and a brief encounter. However, as Emma takes refuge in his opulent yet empty mansion, her mysterious demeanor and guarded secrets begin to intrigue him. Little does Jonathan know that Emma's past is intertwined with a part of his life he's long tried to forget. As the storm rages on outside, the truths they uncover within the mansion will challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. Jonathan Hayes was a name that resonated in the upper echelons of society. Known for his sharp business acumen and an empire built on cutting-edge technology, he had been the subject of countless headlines and profiles over the years. Yet the man himself had become a mystery. Following a string of personal losses, Jonathan retreated from the public eye, choosing the solitude of his sprawling hilltop mansion over the glitz and glamour of his previous life. The mansion, an architectural marvel of glass and stone, perched high above the countryside. Its vast halls and meticulously landscaped grounds spoke of wealth and power, but the life within its walls had grown stagnant. Once a venue for lavish parties and elite gatherings, it was now a quiet refuge for a man who had turned his back on the world. Jonathan kept only the essential staff, Mrs. Grant, his loyal housekeeper, and a small team of groundskeepers who ensured the estate remained in pristine condition. He spoke little, interacted less, and avoided the outside world as much as possible. One evening, a storm swept across the countryside, with a ferocity that hadn't been seen in years. The wind howled. Rain pounded against the mansion's large windows, and thunder shook the very foundation of the estate. Jonathan sat alone in his study, the flickering light of a fire casting shadows on the walls. A glass of scotch rested in his hand, untouched as he stared out at the storm, lost in thought. The storm mirrored the chaos that sometimes roiled within him, though he rarely let it show. He had mastered the art of maintaining a stoic exterior, even as memories of his past haunted him. He thought of his younger self, a man full of ambition, passion, and dreams, and wondered if that version of him still existed beneath the layers of loss and isolation he had wrapped himself in. As the storm raged on, a sudden frantic knocking at the front door shattered the stillness. Jonathan stiffened, his brow furrowing. Visitors were rare, especially in the middle of the night and in such treacherous weather. Rising from his chair, he made his way through the dimly lit halls, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. When he opened the massive oak door, the sight before him took him by surprise. A young woman stood on the doorstep, drenched from head to toe. Her soaked clothes clung to her hair plastered against her face, and her wide eyes were filled with desperation. She was shivering violently, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to keep warm. "Please," she managed to say, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. I didn't know where else to go." Jonathan hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside. "Come in," he said, his deep voice firm yet laced with concern. The woman stumbled into the grand foyer, her legs weak from exhaustion. Jonathan closed the door behind her, shutting out the fury of the storm. Without waiting for an explanation, he guided her toward the fireplace in the living room, where the warmth of the flames provided a stark contrast to the chill she had endured. "Sit," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. He grabbed a blanket from a nearby chair and draped it over her shoulders before calling out, "Mrs. Grant." The housekeeper appeared moments later, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity as she took in the unexpected guest. "Prepare some tea and find her something dry to wear," Jonathan said. Mrs. Grant nodded and hurried off, leaving Jonathan alone with the woman. He studied her as she sat by the fire, her trembling hands clutching the blanket tightly. There was a vulnerability about her that tugged at something deep within him, though he couldn't quite place why. "What were you doing out there in this storm?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. "I was driving," she said, her voice still shaky. "My car broke down a few miles back. I tried to find shelter, but there was nothing. Then I saw your house." Jonathan nodded slowly, his sharp eyes taking in the faint shadows under her eyes, the weariness in her posture. "You're lucky you made it here," he said. "This storm isn't forgiving." Mrs. Grant returned with a steaming cup of tea and a set of dry clothes. The woman, Emma, she introduced herself, accepted both with gratitude. She disappeared briefly to change, and when she returned, she looked more like herself. Her damp hair framed a face that, while weary, was undeniably striking, with eyes that seemed to carry secrets she wasn't ready to share. Jonathan sat across from her, his posture relaxed but his gaze keen. "You'll stay here for the night," he said. "It's too dangerous to go back out there." Emma hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with imposing, but the firmness in Jonathan's tone left little room for protest. "Thank you," she said softly. "I promise I'll repay your kindness." Jonathan waved her words away. "Let's get through the night first." Later, as the storm continued to rage, Jonathan found himself unable to sleep. He paced the halls of the mansion, his thoughts returning to Emma. There was something about her that didn't quite add up. Why had she been driving alone in such weather? Where had she been heading, and why did she seem so guarded? The logical part of him told him it wasn't his business, but the part of him that hadn't yet hardened completely couldn't help but wonder. Meanwhile, in the guest room, Emma sat on the edge of the bed clutching an old photograph. The edges of the picture were worn, the colors slightly faded, but the image was clear. A young boy standing beside a woman with a smile that mirrored her own. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to the photo, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm so close now," she said. "Please, let this be the right place." The storm was not just a coincidence, it was a catalyst. It had brought Emma to Jonathan's doorstep, and it would force them both to confront truths they had spent years trying to bury. As the rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled through the trees, neither of them could have predicted how their lives were about to change. The morning after the storm revealed a world transformed. The countryside surrounding the Hayes estate, usually serene and picturesque, now bore the marks of the tempest. Fallen branches littered the ground, and the air smelled of wet earth and rain. Yet, inside the grand mansion, the storm's effects lingered not just in the weathered landscape, but in the minds of its occupants. Jonathan sat in the dining room at a long, polished mahogany table. A steaming cup of coffee rested in his hands, and the faint rustling of newspapers filled the otherwise silent space. Across from him, Emma Carter sat quietly, her posture upright yet tense. She sipped tea, her gaze fixed on the large window overlooking the garden. The estate's sprawling grounds, usually so inviting, now seemed drenched in an unsettling stillness. Jonathan broke the silence, his voice measured and calm. "Did you sleep well?" Emma glanced up, startled. "As well as I could, considering everything," she replied softly. "Thank you again, Mr. Hayes. I'll be out of your way as soon as the roads are clear." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, setting his cup down. "In this weather? I doubt the roads will be passable for at least another day, and even if they were, you'd be leaving without answers." Emma's hands tightened around her teacup. "Answers?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze locked on hers. "People don't just show up on my doorstep during the worst storm of the year by coincidence. And while I'm not questioning the severity of your situation, I get the sense that your being here isn't entirely accidental." Emma flinched, but she quickly masked her discomfort with a neutral expression. "I told you my car broke down. And you happened to be driving on one of the most secluded roads in the region?" Jonathan countered. "Forgive me if I find that hard to believe." Emma met his gaze, her own eyes flashing with defiance. "Believe what you want, Mr. Hayes. I don't owe you an explanation." Jonathan's expression didn't waver, but he leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. "Fair enough, but if there's something you're hiding, you might find it easier to tell me now than later." Emma said nothing, her jaw tightening as she averted her gaze. Jonathan let the matter drop for the moment, but his curiosity had been ignited. There was more to this woman than she was letting on, and he intended to find out what it was. After breakfast, Emma wandered through the mansion's vast halls, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floors. Despite the tension between her and Jonathan, she couldn't help but marvel at the estate's grandeur. The chandeliers sparkled like constellations, the artwork on the walls seemed to whisper stories of distant lands, and the antique furniture exuded an air of timeless elegance. Yet for all its beauty, the mansion felt cold, like a museum rather than a home. She found herself drawn to the library, a cavernous room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The scent of aged paper and leather filled the air, and the morning light streaming through the tall windows bathed the space in a golden glow. Emma ran her fingers along the spines of the books, feeling a strange mix of awe and unease. This was a place built for someone who valued knowledge and history, yet it also spoke of solitude and retreat. As she explored the library, she came across a small desk cluttered with papers and an open journal. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, the ink dark and precise. Emma hesitated, then leaned closer, her curiosity getting the better of her. The journal entries were brief but revealing, chronicling Jonathan's thoughts over the past few years. Another investor meeting today. Feels like a waste of time. No one understands the vision anymore. The estate is quiet again. Too quiet. Sometimes I wonder if the silence is more of a curse than a refuge. I can't keep running from the past, but I also can't face it. Not yet. Emma's heart ached as she read the words. She recognized the pain behind them, the struggle of a man trying to find meaning in a life that had lost its luster. But before she could read further, the sound of footsteps made her freeze. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, his arms crossed. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Emma straightened, quickly stepping away from the desk. "I was just admiring your collection," she said, forcing a smile. "It's impressive." Jonathan entered the room, his gaze briefly flicking to the open journal before returning to her. "Books have always been a refuge for me," he said, "a way to escape." Emma nodded, her expression softening. "I understand that." Jonathan studied her for a moment, then gestured toward a chair. "Sit," he said. "There's something I want to discuss." Reluctantly, Emma took a seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jonathan leaned against the desk, his posture relaxed but his gaze unwavering. "You're not just a stranded traveler, Emma. You showed up here for a reason, and I'd like to know what it is." Emma's throat tightened, her mind racing for a response. "I already told you," Jonathan raised a hand, cutting her off. "Your car breaking down might explain why you ended up at my doorstep, but it doesn't explain why you were on this road to begin with. Most people don't even know it exists." Emma hesitated, her pulse quickening. She knew she couldn't keep deflecting forever, but she wasn't ready to reveal the truth. Not yet. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Jonathan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps not. But you should know that I don't tolerate dishonesty, Emma. If you're hiding something, it will come to light eventually." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Emma to grapple with the weight of his words. That evening, as the storm's remnants lingered in the form of a gentle drizzle, Emma found herself sitting by the fireplace in the living room. The flames crackled softly, their warmth a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in her chest. She stared into the fire, her thoughts consumed by the secret she carried. Jonathan entered the room, a glass of scotch in hand. He took a seat across from her, his eyes studying her intently. "You look like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders," he remarked. Emma let out a bitter laugh. "You could say that." Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I've seen that look before. You're carrying something heavy, something you don't think you can share. But let me tell you this. Secrets have a way of eating you alive. Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "You don't understand," she said softly. "This secret, it could change everything." Jonathan's expression softened, and for the first time, Emma saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Then let it," he said quietly. "Sometimes, change is exactly what we need." The tension between them lingered as the night wore on. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Jonathan's words held a truth she hadn't allowed herself to consider. Perhaps it was time to stop running from her past and start confronting it. But how could she begin to explain the connection she shared with a man who had no idea how deeply their lives were intertwined? As she lay awake in the guest room, clutching the photograph of the boy she had loved and lost, Emma made a decision. Tomorrow, she would tell Jonathan everything. Little did she know, Jonathan was making plans of his own. Plans to uncover the truth about the woman who had stormed into his life and shaken the foundation of his carefully constructed world. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of the Hayes mansion, illuminating a household that had been irrevocably shaken. For years, Jonathan Hayes had lived in calculated solitude, his life compartmentalized into business, philanthropy, and personal grief. But Emma Carter's revelation, her connection to his late brother Michael and the child he never knew existed, had shattered that carefully curated balance. Jonathan sat in his study, his fingers tightly clutching the worn photograph Emma had handed him. The boy in the picture was undeniably connected to his family. The resemblance to Michael was uncanny. Jonathan's mind raced as memories of his brother flooded back. Michael's easy laughter, his impulsive charm, and the secrets he had evidently taken. The study, usually Jonathan's sanctuary, now felt suffocating. He rose abruptly, pacing in front of the wide desk that held his meticulously arranged papers. Emma's words from the previous night echoed in his mind. Liam was my son, and Michael was his father. In the guest room, Emma sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the same photograph Jonathan now held. The boy in the image had been her world, a bright, curious child who had loved to paint and play with building blocks. Losing Liam had nearly destroyed her. Telling Jonathan about him had been both terrifying and cathartic, but now the fear of his judgment consumed her. She worried that he might resent her for keeping such a significant truth hidden for so long. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Mrs. Grant entered carrying a tray of tea and biscuits. The housekeeper's kind eyes studied Emma for a moment before she spoke. "You've stirred something in him," Mrs. Grant said gently, setting the tray down on the bedside table. "I haven't seen Mr. Hayes this unsettled in years." Emma forced a faint smile, her hands trembling as she picked up the teacup. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she murmured. "I just thought he had the right to know." Mrs. Grant nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Secrets have a way of weighing us down, dear. But sometimes sharing them is the first step toward healing." Jonathan emerged from his study later that morning, his expression grim but resolute. He found Emma in the garden, sitting by the stone fountain that had become her retreat during her brief time at the estate. She looked up as he approached, her eyes shadowed with uncertainty. "We need to talk," Jonathan said, his voice steady but lacking its usual cool detachment. Emma nodded, bracing herself. "I know." Jonathan sat beside her, holding up the photograph. "Tell me everything," he said. "No more half-truths. I need to know who Liam was and why Michael never told me about him." Emma took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of her dress as she began to speak. "Michael and I met when we were both in our early 20s, she said softly. "I was working as a waitress and he swept me off my feet. He was charming, passionate, and so full of life. We fell for each other quickly." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his focus unwavering. "For a while everything was perfect," Emma continued. "But Michael wasn't ready to settle down. He had dreams, big ones, and he didn't want anything holding him back. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know how to tell him, and before I could, he was gone." "Gone where?" Jonathan asked sharply. Emma hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. "He said he had a business opportunity overseas. He promised he'd be back, but then the accident happened." Jonathan's heart sank. He remembered the day he had received the call about Michael's fatal car crash. It had been a devastating blow, one that had left a void in his life he had never been able to fill. To now learn that Michael had left behind a child Jonathan had never known existed, was almost too much to process. "Why didn't you come to me?" Jonathan asked, his voice a mixture of anger and hurt. "Why did you keep this from me for so long?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't think you'd want to hear from me," she admitted. "I was just a waitress, Jonathan. I didn't think I mattered to your family. And after Liam, after I lost him, I didn't know if I could face you. But then I found this photograph, and I realized I couldn't keep running." Jonathan stared at her, his emotions a turbulent mix of grief, frustration, and something else, something he couldn't yet name. "You should have come to me sooner," he said quietly. "Michael was my brother. If he had a son, I had a right to know." "I know," Emma said, her voice breaking. "And I'm sorry. I just didn't know how to tell you." The rest of the day passed in a haze of reflection for both of them. Jonathan retreated to his study once more, poring over old photographs and letters from Michael, searching for any hint of the secret his brother had kept. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he had truly known about Michael's life outside their shared business ventures and family gatherings. Emma, meanwhile, wandered the estate, her heart heavy with guilt and uncertainty. She found herself drawn to the art studio tucked away in one corner of the mansion, a space that had clearly been neglected for years. The dust-covered easels and dried-up paint tubes reminded her of Liam, who had loved to create. Tears streamed down her face as she ran her fingers over the abandoned canvases. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan found Emma in the art studio. She turned as he entered, her expression wary. "I didn't know this room was still here," Emma said softly, gesturing to the easels. "It reminds me of Liam. He loved to paint." Jonathan leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed. "Michael loved to paint too," he said. "It was one of the few things he truly enjoyed. I suppose Liam inherited that from him." Emma nodded, her gaze distant. "He was a wonderful boy," she said. "Smart, creative, and so full of life. Losing him was the hardest thing I've ever been through." Jonathan stepped closer, his tone softening. "I can't imagine what that must have been like," he said. "But you don't have to carry this alone anymore." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "Do you mean that?" Jonathan nodded. "Michael was my brother. Liam was my nephew. That makes you part of my family, whether you like it or not." As the days passed, Jonathan and Emma began to piece together the fragments of their shared past. They spoke at length about Michael, about Liam, and about the choices that had led them to this moment. The pain of their losses was still raw, but in each other they found a glimmer of hope, a chance to heal. But as they began to rebuild their connection, the past threatened to resurface in unexpected ways. Jonathan received a cryptic letter one afternoon, its sender unknown. The letter contained a single line that sent a chill down his spine. Michael's secrets didn't die with him. Jonathan shared the letter with Emma, his jaw tight with determination. "I don't know who sent this," he said, "but I intend to find out." Emma's heart raced as she read the words. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jonathan admitted. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together." The truth about Michael's life and his death was far more complex than either of them could have imagined. And as Jonathan and Emma delved deeper into the mystery, they realized that their journey was only just beginning. The cryptic letter had shaken Jonathan Hayes to his core. Its single ominous line, "Michael's secrets didn't die with him," sent a wave of uncertainty and dread through the mansion. For years, Jonathan had accepted his brother's untimely death as a tragic accident, a chapter of his life closed with more grief than closure. But now, the words of an unknown sender had reopened old wounds and raised unsettling questions. Sitting in his study, Jonathan stared at the letter on his desk. The paper was thick, the handwriting neat but unrecognizable. No signature, no return address. Whoever had written it knew something Jonathan felt compelled to uncover. But the fear of what he might find lingered in the back of his mind. Meanwhile, Emma Carter stood in the mansion's expansive garden, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm afternoon sun. The revelation of her connection to Michael and Liam had brought her and Jonathan closer. But the arrival of the letter had introduced a new layer of tension. She couldn't help but feel that her decision to come to the estate had stirred something dormant, something dangerous. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps crunching against the gravel path. Turning, she saw Jonathan approaching, his expression a mixture of determination and hesitation. "We need to talk," he said, his voice. Emma nodded, her heart pounding. "I know. The letter—" Jonathan gestured for her to follow him, and they walked together toward a secluded bench beneath a blooming magnolia tree. The scent of the flowers was sweet, almost soothing, but the tension between them was palpable. "Do you have any idea who might have sent it?" Jonathan asked, breaking the silence. Emma shook her head. "No. But if it's about Michael, it could be someone from his past, someone who knew about Liam or something else." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Michael was always secretive. Even when we were close, there were parts of his life he kept hidden. I thought it was just his way, but now I'm starting to wonder if there was more to it. Emma placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together. You don't have to do this alone." Jonathan looked at her, his blue eyes softening. "Neither do you," he said. "You've carried enough on your own, Emma. It's time we both stopped running from the past." Over the following weeks, Jonathan and Emma worked together to piece together the fragments of Michael's life. Jonathan reached out to old friends, colleagues, and anyone who might have known Michael during the years leading up to his death. Emma revisited her own memories, recounting moments she had shared with Michael, and trying to identify anything that might explain the letter's message. It wasn't long before they uncovered the first clue: a bank account in Michael's name that Jonathan had never known existed. The account, hidden under layers of encryption and legal obfuscation, held a substantial sum of money, but its origin was unclear. The transactions were erratic, suggesting something more than ordinary business dealings. Jonathan stared at the bank statement on his computer screen, his brow furrowed. What was he involved in? He muttered. Emma, sitting beside him, leaned closer to study the document. Could it have been a side project? Something he didn't want tied to your family's name? Jonathan shook his head. If it were legitimate, there'd be no reason to hide it. This feels deliberate, like he was protecting something or someone. As they delved deeper into Michael's financial records, they discovered several payments had been made to an address in a small remote town several hours from the Hayes estate. Jonathan's curiosity grew, but so did his apprehension. What could Michael have been funding in such an obscure location? Determined to find answers, Jonathan and Emma decided to visit the town. They left early one morning, the tension between them heavy but unspoken. The drive was long and quiet, the countryside passing in a blur of green fields and winding roads. When they arrived, the town was exactly what they had expected: quaint, quiet, and unassuming. The address led them to a modest house on the outskirts, its faded paint and overgrown garden suggesting years of neglect. Jonathan hesitated before knocking on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. An elderly woman answered, her eyes narrowing as she took in the strangers on her doorstep. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious. Jonathan introduced himself, explaining that he was Michael Ha. At the mention of Michael's name, the woman's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition and something darker crossing her face. "You'd better come in," she said finally, stepping aside to let them enter. Inside, the house was cluttered but cozy, filled with photographs, knickknacks, and the unmistakable smell of freshly baked bread. The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret, led them to a small sitting room and gestured for them to take a seat. "What do you know about Michael Hayes?" Margaret asked, her gaze sharp. Jonathan hesitated, then replied, "I know he was my brother, and I know he was keeping secrets. I'm trying to find out why." Margaret nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Michael was a good man," she said, "but he got involved in something he couldn't control, something dangerous." Emma leaned forward, her voice trembling. "What do you mean? What was he involved in?" Margaret sighed, her shoulders slumping. "There was a group, a powerful group. They funded projects, bought businesses, controlled things from the shadows. Michael got tangled up with them when he was younger, and he spent the rest of his life trying to get out. Jonathan's stomach dropped. Why didn't he tell me? Margaret's gaze softened. He was protecting you. And when he found out about Liam, well, that's when he really started to fight back. He didn't want his son to grow up in that world. The revelation hit Jonathan and Emma like a freight train. Michael hadn't just been secretive. He had been fighting a battle they had never known about, one that had ultimately cost him his life. The letter's message now made sense. Michael's secrets hadn't died with him because the people he had tried to escape were still out there. As they left Margaret's house, Jonathan and Emma were filled with a newfound resolve. The truth about Michael's life and death was more complex than they had imagined, but it also held the key to understanding their own roles in his legacy. "We can't stop now," Jonathan said as they drove away. "If these people are still out there, we need to know who they are and what they want." Emma nodded, her determination matching his. "We owe it to Michael and to Liam." Back at the estate, the atmosphere had shifted. The secrets they had uncovered were heavy, but they also brought a sense of clarity. Jonathan and Emma were no longer just two people haunted by the past. They were partners in a mission to uncover the truth and honor the memory of the man who had connected them. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt a spark of hope, and as he looked at Emma, he realized that the journey they had embarked on together was as much about the future as it was about the past. The cryptic threads connecting Michael Hayes' hidden life, Dominic Shaw's veiled warnings, and the ominous letter began to tighten around Jonathan and Emma, drawing them inexorably toward a dangerous confrontation. The answers they sought were tantalizingly close, but the risks had never been higher. Every step deeper into Michael's shadowed past uncovered more secrets, secrets that threatened not only their safety, but also the fragile trust they had built. The confrontation with Shaw had left Jonathan furious, yet resolute. His veiled threats and mocking tone confirmed that Michael's death had been no mere accident. For Jonathan, who had spent years burying his grief, it was like ripping open an old wound. For Emma, it was a validation of the fears she had carried since losing Liam, a boy who had been the unwitting collateral in a game far beyond their understanding. Back at the Hayes mansion, the tension was palpable. Jonathan paced the length of his study, his hands clenched into fists while Emma sat at the desk, poring over the financial records they had uncovered. The clues were scattered, but they pointed to one undeniable truth. Michael had been caught in a web of powerful forces, and his attempt to break free had cost him his life. "We can't stop now," Jonathan said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Shaw knows more than he let on, but he's terrified. Whatever Michael was trying to expose was big enough to scare even him." Emma looked up, her expression weary but determined. "And if Shaw is scared, that means these people are still out there. They haven't forgotten Michael and they're watching us now." Jonathan's gaze darkened. "Let them watch. I won't stop until I know the truth." The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Jonathan's investigators, a tech-savvy former journalist, had managed to trace a series of encrypted emails linked to the bank account Michael had kept hidden. The messages, dated shortly before Michael's death, were addressed to someone known only as A. "It's not much to go on," the investigator admitted during a late-night video call. "But whoever A is, they were Michael's last point of contact. The encryption levels suggest Michael trusted this person enough to share sensitive information." Jonathan nodded, his jaw tightening. "And what about the sender?" The investigator hesitated. "The trail leads back to an offshore server. I'm still working on breaking through, but I'll need more time." Jonathan ended the call and turned to Emma, who had been silently listening. "Michael trusted someone enough to involve them in this mess," he said. "If we can find A, we might finally get some answers." The search for A led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place once owned by one of Michael's defunct companies. The building was dilapidated, its windows boarded up and its exterior overrun with weeds. But as Jonathan and Emma approached, they saw signs of recent activity. Tire tracks in the dirt, footprints leading to the entrance. "Stay close," Jonathan said, his voice low. He carried a flashlight in one hand, its beam cutting through the gloom as they stepped inside. The interior was eerily quiet, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. Old machinery and broken furniture littered the space, but it was the makeshift office in the far corner that caught their attention. A single desk, a laptop, and a corkboard filled with photographs and notes suggested someone had been working here, and recently. Emma's eyes widened as she studied the corkboard. Among the pinned items was a photograph of Michael, standing with a group of people she didn't recognize. There were notes scrawled in a hurried hand, connecting names, dates, and locations with red string. Whoever was here was piecing it together, just like us, Emma whispered. Jonathan approached the laptop, its screen still glowing faintly. He tapped the keyboard and to his surprise it sprang to life. A single file was open, its contents a collection of emails, photographs, and financial records, all tied to Michael and the shadowy organization he had been fighting against. "They left this for us," Jonathan said, his voice tinged with awe and suspicion. "It's too convenient." Before Emma could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Jonathan spun around, his flashlight beam landing on a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin with a face weathered by age and stress. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice sharp. "It's not safe." Jonathan stepped forward, his posture tense. "Who are you?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "I'm Anthony," he said. "Michael's friend. Or at least I was." Anthony, it turned out, was A. He had been one of Michael's confidants, someone who had helped him gather evidence against the organization that had ensnared him. But when Michael died, Anthony had gone underground, fearing for his own life. "They're everywhere," Anthony said, his eyes darting around nervously. "They control more than you can imagine. Banks, governments, media. Michael was trying to expose them, but he didn't realize how deep it went." "Why send the letter to me?" Jonathan demanded. "Why not finish what Michael started yourself?" Anthony shook his head. "I'm no hero, Mr. Hayes. I tried to disappear, but I couldn't let his work die with him. You have the resources, the power. If anyone can finish this, it's you." Jonathan's expression hardened. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Anthony hesitated, then pulled a USB drive from his pocket. "Everything you need to know is on this," he said. "But be careful. They'll stop at nothing to protect themselves." Back at the mansion, Jonathan and Emma examined the contents of the USB drive. The files contained a trove of information: names, financial transactions, and evidence of illegal activities ranging from money laundering to human trafficking. The organization's reach was vast, its influence terrifying. "This is why Michael died," Jonathan said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He was trying to take them down and they silenced him." Emma placed a hand on his arm. "And now it's up to us." Jonathan nodded, his resolve firm. "But we can't do it alone. If we go public with this, we'll need allies, people who can't be bought or intimidated." The climax of their journey came in the form of a high-stakes meeting with a trusted journalist, someone Jonathan had worked with in the past. Under the cover of darkness, they handed over the evidence, knowing the risks they were taking. "This story will shake the world," the journalist said, his eyes wide as he reviewed the files. "But it's going to put a target on your back." "We're ready," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "Michael gave his life for this. We won't let his sacrifice be in vain." As the first headlines broke, the world watched in shock as the secrets of a shadowy organization were laid bare. Arrests were made, investigations launched, and the wheels of justice began to turn. For Jonathan and Emma, the fight was far from over, but they had taken the first step in honoring Michael's legacy. In the quiet of the mansion's garden, Jonathan and Emma sat together, their hands entwined as they reflected on everything they had been through. The journey had tested their strength, their courage, and their bond. But in the end, they had emerged stronger, united by a shared purpose and a deep respect for the man who had brought them together. "Michael would be proud," Emma said softly. Jonathan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. And we're just getting started. The fallout from the revelations was both swift and far-reaching. The shadowy organization that Michael Hayes had fought so hard to expose was now a global scandal. News outlets across the world reported on the corruption, money laundering, and trafficking operations that had flourished under the guise of legitimate enterprises. Arrests were made at the highest levels, as names from the USB drive surfaced in public and private sectors. But with each victory came greater risks for those who had brought these truths to light. For Jonathan Hayes and Emma Carter, the past weeks had been a whirlwind of media attention, legal battles, and personal reflection. The mansion, once a fortress of isolation and grief, now buzzed with activity as lawyers, journalists, and investigators sought their insight into the unraveling conspiracy. Despite the chaos, Jonathan maintained his calm demeanor. He had spent years navigating the ruthless world of business, but this challenge was different. It wasn't about profit margins or mergers. It was about justice, about ensuring that Michael's sacrifice meant something. One evening, as Jonathan sat in his study, his phone buzzed with a call from the journalist they had entrusted with the evidence. "Jonathan," the voice said, excitement tinged with caution. "The story is gaining traction, but there's backlash. People are scared. Some of them high-profile enough to make noise. You need to be ready." Jonathan's grip tightened on the phone. "Let them come," he said, his voice steady. "I've faced worse, and this time, I'm fighting for something that matters." The journalist hesitated before responding. "Just watch your back. This isn't over." As the call ended, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the photograph of Michael that now sat on his desk. His brother's face stared back at him, a reminder of the man who had inspired this fight. "We're not done yet," Jonathan muttered. "But we'll finish this. For you." Emma, meanwhile, found solace in the garden, where she often sat with a sketchpad, drawing scenes from her memories of Liam. The garden had become a sanctuary for her, a place where she could process the events that had upended her life. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the air. One afternoon, as she sketched, Mrs. Grant approached, her expression filled with concern. "You've been through a lot, my dear," the housekeeper said gently. "But you've handled it with grace. Michael would be proud." Emma smiled faintly. "I just hope this is enough to honor him. And Liam." Mrs. Grant placed a comforting hand on Emma's shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could have asked. And you've given Mr. Hayes something he hasn't had in years. Hope." The mansion itself began to reflect the change in Jonathan and Emma's lives. Rooms that had long been unused were reopened, filled with light and laughter as allies visited to discuss the next steps in their fight. Jonathan, who had once preferred solitude, now found himself welcoming the company. And Emma, who had entered his life as a stranger, was now an integral part of the household. One evening, as they sat together in the library, Jonathan turned to Emma, his expression contemplative. "Do you ever think about what's next?" he asked. Emma looked up from the book she was reading. "What do you mean?" Jonathan leaned forward, his hands clasped. "We've spent so much time looking into the past, Michael's past, Liam's past. But what about the future? What do you want for yourself?" Emma hesitated, her gaze distant. "I've been so focused on making sure Michael's story is told that I haven't thought much about myself. But I do know one thing. I want to keep fighting for what's right. For Liam's memory, and for others who might be in the same position." Jonathan nodded, admiration flickering in his eyes. "Then we'll do it together." As the weeks turned into months, Jonathan and Emma began to rebuild their lives around their shared mission. The mansion became a hub for advocacy, with Jonathan using his resources to fund investigations into corruption, and Emma lending her voice to those who had been silenced by fear. Together, they built a foundation in Liam's name, dedicated to supporting children and families affected by the organization's crimes. The foundation's launch event was held in the mansion's grand ballroom, which had been transformed into a vibrant space filled with supporters, journalists, and families whose lives had been touched by the initiative. Jonathan stood at the podium, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about justice for my brother or my nephew," he said. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what they did. We can't undo the past, but we can fight for a better future. Emma stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. As the crowd applauded, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. They had turned their pain into purpose, and while the journey was far from over, they were no longer alone in the fight. Later that night, as the guests departed and the mansion grew quiet, Jonathan and Emma found themselves in the garden, where the scent of blooming flowers filled the air. The stars above were brilliant, unclouded by the haze of the city. Jonathan turned to Emma, his expression soft. "Thank you," he said simply. Emma tilted her head, a smile playing on her lips. "For what?" "For coming here," he said. "For staying. For reminding me that there's more to life than grief and anger." Emma's eyes glistened as she reached for his hand. "You've done the same for me, Jonathan. I thought I'd lost everything, but you gave me a reason to keep going." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared journey settling over them like a warm embrace. Then Jonathan spoke again, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We've come a long way," he said, "but I think Michael would be proud of what we've done." Emma nodded, her heart full. And Liam too. As they stood together under the stars, Jonathan and Emma knew that their fight was far from over. But they also knew they had found something that would sustain them through whatever came next. Hope, love, and the unshakable bond that had brought them together. 5 years had passed since Jonathan Hayes and Emma Carter had uncovered the tangled web of secrets that surrounded Michael Hayes' life and death. In those years, they had built something remarkable. A legacy not just for Michael, but for Liam, and for every family whose lives had been touched by corruption, greed, and injustice. The Hayes estate, once a fortress of solitude and grief, now thrived as a hub of hope, a beacon for change. The Liam Hayes Foundation, born from the pain of their shared losses, had grown into a global force. With its mission of advocacy and support for vulnerable families, the foundation had funded schools, rebuilt communities, and provided legal aid to those fighting against systemic oppression. Its reach extended to corners of the world Jonathan had never imagined visiting, and its impact was felt by countless lives. But for Jonathan and Emma, the journey had been more than professional. It had been deeply personal, shaping them into partners not just in their mission but in life. The scars of their past had given way to something beautiful, something neither had dared to dream of when they first met. On a cool spring morning, the Hayes estate was alive with activity. Families, advocates, and foundation supporters had gathered for the annual Day of Remembrance, an event honoring the lives of Michael and Liam while celebrating the progress the foundation had made. Jonathan stood on the mansion's grand balcony, overlooking the gardens where the event was in full swing. The air buzzed with energy. Children ran through the flower beds, laughing as they chased butterflies, while parents and volunteers mingled around tables adorned with photographs and stories of the lives the foundation had changed. Jonathan's gaze swept the crowd, but it lingered on one figure in particular. Emma Carter stood near a small fountain, surrounded by children as she knelt to their level, helping them plant flowers. Her hair shimmered in the sunlight, and her easy laughter carried on the breeze. She was the heart of the estate now, a source of warmth and connection for everyone who entered its gates. As Jonathan descended the stairs to join her, he passed by one of the displays, a large photo of Michael holding a paintbrush, his face lit with a carefree smile. Below it was a plaque that read, "In memory of Michael Hayes, a fighter, a dreamer, a beloved brother." The sight gave Jonathan pause. For a moment, the weight of everything they had accomplished washed over him. Michael's dream of making a difference had not only survived but thrived, carried forward by the brother he had left behind and the woman who had loved him. When Jonathan reached the garden, Emma looked up and smiled. "You're finally joining us," she teased, brushing dirt off her hands. Jonathan smirked, tucking his hands into his pockets. "I figured I should see what all the fuss is about." One of the children, a boy no older than 6, tugged on Emma's dress, holding up a tiny sprout. "Miss Emma, is this one okay?" Emma crouched down, inspecting the sprout with exaggerated seriousness. "It's perfect," she said with a grin. "Just like you." The boy beamed, and Jonathan felt a pang of emotion as he watched. Moments like these had become common since Emma had entered his life, but they never failed to remind him of how much she had changed his world. After the boy ran off, Emma straightened and turned to Jonathan. "Everything looks beautiful today," she said softly, her gaze sweeping the vibrant garden. "You've built something incredible here." Jonathan reached for her hand, his expression tender. "We built it together." Later that evening, as the guests began to depart, Jonathan and Emma found themselves walking through the mansion's quiet halls. The day had been a resounding success, raising more funds and awareness than any previous year. But for Jonathan, the true reward was the sense of peace that had settled over the estate. In the library, they paused before the portrait of Michael that hung above the fireplace. Jonathan studied his brother's face, a mixture of sadness and gratitude in his eyes. "He would have loved this," Jonathan said, his voice quiet. "Seeing how many lives we've touched." Emma stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "He'd be proud of you, Jonathan, of everything you've done." Jonathan turned to her, his expression softening. "I couldn't have done it without you. You've given me purpose and hope." Emma smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "And you've given me a family." They stood in silence for a moment, their shared journey reflected in the flickering firelight. Then Jonathan spoke again, his voice steady. "We've come so far, and we're not done yet." As the weeks turned into months, the foundation continued to grow. New programs were launched, partnerships were formed, and the Hayes name became synonymous with integrity and resilience. Jonathan and Emma traveled often, visiting communities impacted by the foundation's work. Each trip deepened their bond, their shared mission solidifying their partnership in ways that went beyond words. Back at the mansion, life took on a new rhythm. The once empty halls were now filled with laughter and conversation, the sound of children's footsteps echoing through spaces that had long been silent. Emma took on a central role in the foundation's creative initiatives, using her artistic talents to inspire and connect with families. Jonathan, for his part, discovered a renewed sense of purpose in mentoring young leaders, individuals who reminded him of Michael's passion and drive. He found solace in their enthusiasm, knowing that the future of their mission was in good hands. One evening, as they prepared for another fundraiser, Jonathan found Emma in the garden, sketching beneath the light of the setting sun. The scene was tranquil, the colors of the sky reflected in the small pond nearby. "Taking a break?" Jonathan asked, his voice warm as he approached. Emma looked up, a playful smile on her lips. "Just capturing the moment." Jonathan sat beside her, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "It's beautiful." Emma nodded, her voice soft. "It feels like home." Jonathan reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "That's because it is. For both of us." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Jonathan smiled, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And there's so much more to do." The Hayes estate, once a symbol of isolation, had become a place of connection and hope. Its transformation mirrored the journey of its inhabitants, a journey marked by loss, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. For Jonathan and Emma, the mansion was more than just a home. It was a testament to the lives they had loved and lost, and a promise to the future they were building together. As the stars emerged overhead, their light casting a soft glow over the garden, Jonathan and Emma sat in peaceful silence. Their hands intertwined, their hearts full. They knew that the story of Michael and Liam would live on, not just in the foundation's work, but in the lives they continued to touch. Together, they faced the future with courage, their love, and shared purpose a beacon in the darkness.